"Step away from her," the cold Duke of Thornleigh said quietly, and 100 wedding guests froze. Narrated by Mr. Aldous Fenwick, retired magistrate of Briarfield, uncle to Miss Coroner Aldwell, recounting the events of that September morning some years hence. I have kept this story to myself for a long time. Not from shame, not from any desire to protect the parties involved. They need no protection now. I kept it because there are moments a man witnesses that belong first and longest to the people who lived them. You wait until you are certain the telling will honor rather than diminish. I am certain now. I will tell you about the morning in St. Aldwyn's Cathedral, when 100 wedding guests stopped breathing at once. I will tell you what one man said with his hands clasped behind his back, and his voice so quiet the stone pillars had to carry it. And I will tell you about my niece Coroner, who had already survived one abandonment at an altar, who had dressed herself that morning in a gown she did not choose, and who stood at the front of that church with her chin level and her eyes dry, because she had decided that whatever happened, she would not let them see her break. She was wrong to think no one was watching. Coroner was 26th of September of the Thornleigh affair, and she was, by the reckoning of our society, on her second chance, which is to say, in their view, very nearly out of chances altogether. 3 years before, she had stood in a different church in different gloves, and the man she was to marry had not come. He had sent a letter instead. I will not repeat its contents. I will say only that it informed her with brisk efficiency that he had accepted the hand of Miss Fairley of Coverton, whose fortune was considerably larger, and that he hoped she would understand the practical necessities that governed men of his station. She was left in the vestibule with her flowers and her mother, and a church full of witnesses. She did not weep in that vestibule. She asked for her cloak, thanked the vicar for his time, and walked out. I was the one who followed her. I was the one who handed her into the carriage and sat across from her in silence while she looked out the window at the autumn fields and said nothing at all for 40 minutes, until she turned and said, in a voice that was perfectly steady, "Uncle Aldous, I think I should like a cup of tea when we get home." And that was all she said about it for a very long time. I do not think she ever truly recovered, not in the way that closes a wound. She recovered in the way that teaches a person not to lean on things. Her mother died the following winter. Her stepfather, Mr. Revel Soane, was a man I had distrusted from the moment my sister married him, a man of good coat and small character, perpetually in debt, perpetually charming his way into extensions of grace from creditors who were growing less gracious by the season. With my sister gone, he had Coroner. He had her name and her quiet respectability, and the fact that she was not yet married, which meant she was still, in the ledger of men like him, an asset not yet spent. He spent her that summer. He arranged the match with Mr. Dorian Felgrove in June. Felgrove was 43, twice widowed, owner of a prosperous mill concern in the northern counties, and in possession of enough ready money to settle Soane's most pressing debts in exchange for a connection to a family that still held some reputation. Coroner was informed of the arrangement, not consulted. When she came to me, she sat in my study with her hands folded and told me what had been decided. She did not ask me to stop it. She was not sure it could be stopped, and she had learned, I think, that hope deployed carelessly only makes the fall longer. I asked her what she thought of Felgrove. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He laughs at things that are not funny." That was Coroner's way, precise. She did not dramatize. She simply named the thing she had seen, and left you to understand what it meant. I understood what it meant. I moved to engage a solicitor. I looked into Soane's debts and Felgrove's settlements and the precise legal terrain of a father's authority over a daughter of Coroner's age and circumstance. There was a great deal that could perhaps be done in time with the right instruments, but time was a luxury Soane had not granted us. The wedding date was set for the 12th of September. It was already the 3rd. I want to tell you about Thornleigh. The Duke of Thornleigh, Caspian, as he was known in his own household, though no one in wider society would have dared the familiarity, was not a man you met so much as encountered. He arrived in rooms the way a change in weather arrives. You felt him before you saw him, something in the air shifting, the conversations around you becoming slightly more careful. He was not old. He was not severe in his features. He was severe in everything else, in the economy of his attention, in the weight of his silences, in the fact that he seemed always to be assessing something just past the immediate social surface, as though he could see the structures underneath and found them, on the whole, wanting. He was called the Cold Duke, and not without reason. He had buried a brother, fought in the campaign on the continent, returned to manage an estate of considerable complexity with no one to advise him and a peerage that watched him, as they watched all-powerful unmarried men with a mixture of calculation and wariness. He had not married. He had not courted. He attended the events that were required of him and departed the moment obligation permitted. He was rich enough that no one dared insult him directly. He was formidable enough that no one dared approach him without purpose. How did he know Corona? That is the question I have been asked when I have told parts of this story to trusted friends. The answer is both simpler and stranger than you might expect. He had met her once, 2 years before the wedding, at a small supper at the home of the Hartwell family in Briarfield. It was not a notable occasion. There were perhaps 16 people. Corona had been there as companion to old Mrs. Hartwell, which was her occupation by that point. She had taken the position quietly without complaint, because it provided independence from her stepfather's house, and she preferred usefulness to dependence. Thornleigh had been there because Hartwell owed him a professional courtesy. I was told by Mrs. Hartwell herself, years later, that Thornleigh had spoken to Corona for perhaps 20 minutes in the corner of the drawing room while the rest of the party played at cards. Mrs. Hartwell had not heard the conversation. She had noticed only that Thornleigh, who customarily wore an expression of tolerant distance in social settings, had listened to whatever Corona was saying with an attention that was not distant at all. That he had laughed once, quietly, and that his eyes had not left her face for the entirety of those 20 minutes. Corona had not mentioned it when she returned home. She mentioned very few things. I do not know whether he sought information about her after that evening. I do not know whether he asked questions of Hartwell or made inquiries through other channels. I know only what happened in September. He appeared in Briarfield 2 days before the wedding. He took rooms at the posting inn. He called on no one. He was seen walking the high street on the morning of the 11th, which was remarked upon, because a duke does not generally walk posting in towns unannounced. He was also seen, and this I learned only afterward, standing outside the church of St. Aldwyn's for some time that afternoon, looking at the door, in the manner of a man calculating the load-bearing capacity of a decision. He attended the wedding. I want you to understand the shape of that morning in St. Aldwyn's. The church was full. Soane had ensured that. A daughter's wedding, even one arranged with indecent speed, is a social occasion, and Soane was not a man who declined the opportunities that social occasions provided. There were perhaps 100 guests. There were flowers. There was the organ, and the murmur of people finding their seats, and the particular energy of a gathering that has come not entirely without the sense that something might be worth watching, because word had circulated, as it always does, about the speed of the arrangement, and people had drawn their own conclusions. I sat in the second pew on the bride's side. I had not slept well. Thornleigh sat, and I did not notice this until later when I thought back and placed it 3 rows behind me on the groom's side in a pew that was not reserved for him and to which no one had invited him. He was simply there, in a dark coat, alone. Corona came in on Soane's arm. She was in ivory, which was not her choice. She had told me she would have preferred gray, and she walked the way she walked everything, which is to say straight-backed and forward-looking, her eyes not seeking the congregation for reassurance or sympathy. She did not look at Felgrove as she approached. She looked at the altar. I watched her face. I had watched her face 3 years ago in that other vestibule, and I knew the particular stillness it wore when she was doing what she had decided to do, and had forbidden herself the luxury of feeling while doing it. It was wearing that stillness now. The ceremony began. The vicar, a young man nervous which did not help anyone, moved through the preamble. The organ quieted. The guests settled. Soane stood to Corona's left with the self-satisfied looseness of a man who has concluded his business successfully. Felgrove stood to her right, and I watched him glance at her with an expression I will not describe in any detail, except to say that it had nothing of reverence in it. We reached the point in the service. You know the one where the vicar asks whether there is any lawful impediment. It is a question asked as a formality, a ritual. No one answers it. It is not designed to be answered. I heard a sound from the back of the church. Not a voice, not yet, just the sound of a pew bench, and then a footstep on stone. And then the voice. Quiet, not raised, not theatrical. The way a man speaks when he does not need to shout because the room will go silent regardless. Step away from her. I have tried over the years to describe what happened in the church in that moment, and I have always failed to do it fully. The closest I can come is this. It was as though the room forgot how to be a room. 100 people ceased their individual functions, breathing, fidgeting, glancing sideways, and became, for a moment, simply a collective waiting. Thornleigh had risen from his pew. He was standing in the aisle. His hands were behind his back. He was not moving toward the altar, not yet, simply standing, in the particular stillness of a man who has passed the point of hesitation and arrived at the place where everything has been decided. He was looking at Felgrove. Felgrove turned. He laughed the same laugh Coroner had described to me, the one that found things funny that were not, and said, with studied ease, "I beg your pardon." "Step away from her," Thornleigh said again, the same volume, the same pitch. "I will not say it a third time." Sohn made a sound, something between outrage and calculation. He was trying to determine in real time which posture would serve him best, which is characteristic of men whose first instinct in any crisis is to identify the strongest party and align with them. He had not yet determined who the strongest party was. He settled on outrage and said loudly, "Your Grace, this is a private ceremony." "I know what it is." Thornleigh moved then, not quickly, with the measured economy of a man who has thought further ahead than the room has. He walked to the altar. He stopped, not at Corona's side, not yet, but between her and Felgrove, which meant Felgrove would need to go through him to reach her. Felgrove was not a small man. He looked at Thornleigh and apparently conducted a rapid private assessment and decided against the calculation he'd been considering. There was a silence that was not empty. It was very full. It had 100 held breaths in it. Thornleigh looked at Coroner. And this, I have turned this over many times, this is where everything shifted from a moment of intervention into something that could not be categorized by any word I had for it before. He looked at her not the way a man looks at a woman he has come to rescue. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone he has been carrying in his mind for a long time and has finally permitted himself to look at directly. He said quietly to her, only to her though the whole church heard him in the silence, "Miss Aldwell, you do not have to stand here." Coroner looked at him. Her face was doing something I had not seen it do in a very long time, not crumbling, nothing so dramatic as that, but loosening. The way ice loosens in the first real warmth of spring. Not broken, beginning. She said in a voice that was steady but not indifferent, that was, for the first time in a long time, not performing steadiness but feeling it, "Your Grace." "Why are you here?" "Because I should have come sooner," he said, "and because I am asking you if you are willing to leave this church with me, not under any obligation, not in exchange for anything, voluntarily, and if you will not, I will find another way to assist you, but I am here." He waited. The church waited. I watched my niece, who had walked into that building having decided not to feel anything, who had been left at one altar and sold to another, who had learned to carry herself as though she needed nothing from the world because the world had been so consistent in its refusals. I watched her look at this man who had appeared in a small drawing room in Briarfield 2 years ago and listened to her for 20 minutes and apparently never stopped listening, and I watched her make a decision. She turned to the vicar. "I am sorry," she said, "for the disruption," as though she were apologizing for an inconvenience at a dinner party, as though she had not just been standing at the altar of her own erasure. Then she turned back to Thornleigh. She said, "I am willing." Sohn objected, at considerable volume and for quite some time. Felgrove, who had the social intelligence of a man who understood when he had lost, retreated to his pew and said very little. Thornleigh did not argue with Sohn. He said once in the same quiet register, "This conversation will take place with my solicitor present. You will find him at the Lamb and Fleece before noon." And then he looked at Coroner and offered her his arm. She took it. They walked down the aisle together, through 100 guests who had forgotten to pretend they weren't watching. I followed 3 steps behind, because there was nothing else to do and because I was, in that moment, so full of something I couldn't name, relief, perhaps, or the particular gratitude that comes when the world does something unexpected and decent, that I needed to move or I thought I might simply sit down in a church pew and stay there. We came out into the September morning. The light was very bright. There was a smell of turned earth and late summer grass, and the sound of the church behind us settling back into its own astonishment. Corina stood on the front step of St. Aldwyn's and looked at the sky for a moment. Then she turned to Thornleigh. "You said not in exchange for anything," she said. "I should like to understand what you meant." "I meant exactly that," he said. "You are not obligated to me. I have no claim on you and I am not asking for one. I came because I could not." He stopped. For the first time since he had spoken in the church, he seemed to be choosing his words with some difficulty. "I came because I could not remain in a room where I knew what was happening to you and do nothing. That is the whole of it." Corina looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You were at the Hartwell supper 2 years ago." "Yes." "You laughed at something I said about the Romans." "Yes." "I wondered afterward," she said, "whether you remembered it." "I have thought about it," he said carefully, "a number of times." She nodded. Not the nod of a woman who has decided anything, the nod of a woman who is adding information to a picture she is building with great deliberateness. She looked out at the lane. Then she said, "My stepfather will not release me easily. He'll call it breach of contract, abandonment of the arrangement, all manner of things." "My solicitor is very good," Thornleigh said. "So is his temper," she said. "Mine is better," he said. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, not quite, but the ghost of one, arriving at the edge of a very long frost. "You are remarkably certain." "About some things," he said. Then, with the same quiet precision he had brought to everything else that morning, he said, "Not about whether you would ever wish to know me better. I am not certain about that at all. I only know that I would very much like the opportunity to find out if you are ever willing, at whatever pace you choose, with no obligation attached." Corina Aldwell, who had walked into St. Aldwyn's Cathedral that morning having concluded that hope was a thing to be managed carefully and deployed never, was quiet for a long moment. "I find," she said at last, "that I am perhaps willing to have tea." I walked back to the inn behind them, and I want to tell you this last thing, because it is the part I remember most clearly. They walked side by side in the September light. They did not touch. There was perhaps a foot of air between them. But there was something in that foot of air, a quality of mutual attention, of two people who have decided to be careful and are finding, in the carefulness, something that is also its own form of closeness, that I had not seen in any arrangement I had observed in 40 years of watching society make its calculations. Soane's solicitor reached us before noon. Thornleigh's solicitor was already there. The business took 2 hours. I will spare you the details. The outcome was that Corina's stepfather was settled and Corina was no longer his to settle. What followed after was slow and deliberate and dignified and exactly suited to who she was. They had many cups of tea. They corresponded for 4 months. He called on her in my home. She had come to stay with me, and I confess I did not suggest otherwise. On Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, which was, as far as I could tell, all he permitted himself, as though he understood that the ground between them required patience and did not intend to rush across it. He told her about his estate. She told him about her music. She played the pianoforte and composed small things she had never shown anyone, and he asked to hear them. And when she played, he listened with his whole attention in the way she had observed in a drawing room in Briarfield 2 years before. He asked her in the February following whether she would do him the honor. She said yes, not quickly, not overwhelmed, with the particular sureness of a woman who had taken a great deal of time to be certain, and was certain. They were married in the spring in the same church, because she wanted it, because she said she would prefer to have a better memory of St. Aldwyn's than the one September had left her with, and because she was, in the end, exactly the kind of woman who reclaims things rather than avoids them. I stood in the second pew again, in the front row, this time on the bride's side where I belonged. When the vicar asked if there was any impediment, I confess I smiled. There was none. I am an old man now, and I have seen a great many things that the world calls romantic and a great many things it calls practical, and in my experience these two categories overlap less than people suppose. What I saw in St. Aldwyn's that September morning was neither sentiment nor calculation. It was a man who had been carrying something carefully for 2 years and chose, finally, to set it down in the only place it could be of any use, and a woman who had learned, the hard way, the cost of hoping, and who chose, one more time, to hope anyway. That is all it was. That is everything it was.